Presidents Farrar and Edwards, my distinguished Barbadian sister, Dr. Daniel, brothers and sisters of the Caribbean and friends of the Caribbean, brothers and sisters of Canada and friends of Canada, it is my honor to join you this morning and to speak on an issue that is of the utmost importance to the Caribbean, but is, of course, of the utmost importance globally. I want to pick up on some of the themes so well elaborated yesterday by my Bahamian colleague, and to try to contextualize. I've been asked to speak about the 30 by 30 initiative, but I want to place that in the context of the wider picture of climate change and to share with you what our experiences have been and to share with you what our advocacy is and to explain to you why it is that we are framing the arguments on climate change in the way that we are framing them, and why it is that you hear Prime Minister Mottley so often on the global scale speaking to the issue of financing changes because of the nature of the climate crisis. I don't know how many of you are fans of the Golden Girls. I see some faces looking blank. Well, it's a story, TV series about 4 women who are retired and they live together in a retirement community. They share a single property. But the oldest one often says to the others, "Picture this." And she would say something like, "Sicily, 1916. And of course, everybody would roll their eyes because it's so out of the frame of their own experiences. But I'm going to do that to you right now. Picture this. The Caribbean, an evening. Close your eyes. You've had a couple hours' notice that there's a hurricane coming. So you've taken all the precautions that you know you should. And you've battened down, and you are in your house, and you hear sounds like thunder. It is the rocks coming down from the hills, and you don't know if they're going to hit your house or not. But what you do know is that the houses of others are being hit because you can hear the screams and you feel the terror. Picture this. The roofs have gone and people are getting soaked, but they can't run. There is nowhere for them to run to. Picture this. Children are screaming and there's nothing you can do to comfort them. The electricity is gone. There is no water. And the only sound you hear is the rushing of the water from the rivers as they descend on your community. The sound that you hear is the swirling of the wind as it takes the roofs. And you pray for it to stop. But for 5 hours relentlessly, winds at 165 miles per hour hit you. And when light comes and it is over, and you step outside, the apocalypse has come to your community. And 95% of the roofs are gone, and 90% of the housing. Your livelihood is gone. You are cut off from the capital. There is no way of communicating with anybody. You have no idea if your friends or relatives in another community are alive. And in a few hours, you will learn that the devastation was island-wide, that the roof of the Prime Minister's residence has gone, and that the country has lost 226% of its GDP. I speak of the experience of my brothers and sisters in Dominica during Hurricane Maria. I could go on and extrapolate that to Hurricane Beryl. I could do it for Gilbert. I could do it for Ivan. I could do it for Katrina. I could do it for numerous others. Climate change is not for us a conversation. Climate change is for us a crisis. It is an existential crisis. And so I want today to set for you, having framed it in such a personal and dramatic way. And Senator Adderley told us yesterday what her personal experience was. Think of the taxi driver in Grenada who said to me, he and his wife both worked in the tourism sector. He lost all of his vehicles. Her hotel shut down, no hotel anymore. His vehicles, when he went to collect insurance, the insurance company said to him, "Oh, well, this is an act of God. We don't insure against acts of God. You can't get any money." So he had nothing. And he had to look after the elderly parents of himself, his mother, and look after his family. And of course, his daughter went off to school elsewhere, a teenager, now out of the watchful eye of her parents. She had to go to another island. I think it was Maria that so devastated Barbados that the entire population had to be relocated, okay? Now, let us compare this with what this means, let's say, in the United States. We hear about the devastation of Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy was only Category 3. We know that Katrina cost the United States $108 billion US in GDP, less than 1%. But we know that the 1.6 billion that Maria cost Dominica represented 226% of GDP. So what we are talking about is a crisis of a different scale depending on where you are located. And the cost of remediation and the cost of resilience is escalated and exacerbated depending on where you are located. So that the personal stories in which we root the crisis identify scale and consequence for real people living their lives every day. So when we come to speak about the climate crisis, we do not come as mendicants, but we come as victims of a crisis that we do not want, that we did not ask for, that we can ill afford to have, and that we do not have the capital to finance. And Sister Adderley spoke yesterday about the polluter must pay principle. It is a basic foundational principle in law that if you cause a situation, the consequence of remediation or the punishment for the cause must be borne by you. And all we are asking for is to understand, or asking people to do, is to understand that it is anthropogenic behavior. It is the lifestyles and the industrialization and the carbon emissions in countries across the world, not in small island developing states, but that are pushing small island developing states to the precipice of economic collapse. And I say the precipice of economic collapse because no country can afford to rebuild from a loss of 226% of GDP when every industry is decimated. President Edwards spoke eloquently to the fact that it will take banana trees 9 years to reproduce. Grenada lost its whole nutmeg crop, and that is its primary export. Dominica lost everything. The trees were shredded. There were just no crops left. And then there is the post-disaster, clean up, clear up. There is the rebuilding process. And you do not start from where you are because you've been pushed back in your development prospects. You have to get back to where you were before you can even start again to go forward. So that when you hear the Prime Minister of Barbados talk about the Bridgetown Initiative, the principal elements of which are in its 3.0 iteration, Bridgetown Initiative 3.0, when the Prime Minister asked, I'm sorry, I should have started to time myself. I figured that I've been talking for about 2 minutes. So I think I've, given the 30 allocated to me, I've got 28 left. I hope you brought your lunch in with you. So essentially, the Bridgetown Initiative has a number of elements. One, we say, or she argues, that there is a global trust fund called Special Drawing Rights, which basically sits in banks, not used. Those who own the majority of the drawing rights are developed countries who do not draw on them. And therefore, she is saying, this is a pool of capital that is available. Let us lend it to those who are in crisis as a consequence of climate change and have to deal with immediate redress of serious impacts, and lend it at rates that are affordable. And I pause here to make the point that when developed countries go to the marketplace to borrow, they borrow at 2% and 4%. Developing countries, such as small island developing states, with their micro business and small economies, borrow at 14% and upward. We have to borrow from those people who cause the very problem because that is where the financiers are. And then we have to turn around if we're borrowing from MDBs or certain institutions or certain entities and use their consultants as well. So this notion that one you give to small island developing states or the developed countries, it is some kind of handout, is fake news because the money is made back in interest and the default rate on loans across the developing world, particularly in the Caribbean, is very, very low, okay? It's made back in interest, it's made back in goods and services that you sell, including consultancy services. She argues that we should look at international taxes, windfall taxes on fossil fuel industry profits, that we should look at taxing aviation and shipping for obvious reasons, and international financial services, as well as the super rich. Well, good luck with collecting that money, because the super rich have a way of, I wouldn't say tax evasion, tax avoidance, which they tell me is legitimate. And in terms of aviation, the way she sees it working is that if you buy a ticket and you're sitting in economy, you pay an extra $5 on your ticket. If you are sitting in premium economy, maybe an extra $10. In business, $100, $200. And if you're sitting in first class, you can take another $1,000 on your ticket without even noticing. So that's the SDRs. It promotes the use of crisis clauses. And the way crisis clauses work is that when you negotiate a loan, you put in a crisis clause, which essentially says, look, in the event that the country is hit by a hurricane or a natural disaster event, that is above 5% of GDP, we are going to change the loan terms so that repayment of the loan is immediately suspended for a period of 2 years, and at the end of the 2-year period, you then start repaying under the same terms and conditions that you would have paid. So again, nothing is lost. The lender continues to be made whole. And then there are debt for nature swaps. And then a primary tenet of the Bridgetown Initiative is the reform of the multilateral development banking system. And it is obvious why I just spoke, for instance, of the interest rates. It is the fact that Barbados, which is regarded as middle income, even though we would have been hard hit by Beryl, even though we would have had previous storms, even though we are in a position where our debt to GDP ratio was 179%, it is now 105% under the most recent administration. And yes, I'm being shameless about my politics. It is the fact that, and in that I've lost my train of thought. That is my punishment. So, yes, okay, so it is the whole reform of the multilateral development system. And I don't have the time to elaborate because I have used quite a bit of time attempting to share some of these principles with you. You need to be conscious of the fact that between 2008 and 2016, there were 21.5 million climate refugees across the globe. That's UNHCR statistics, and that figure is growing. Refugees from climate are now expected to be the largest component of refugees globally up to 2050 and beyond. So you can see that climate is changing population dynamics and the capacity for people to have lands that are livable and livelihoods that are sustainable. You know that areas like the Maldives are already inundated, and that some of the islands in the Pacific, people have already had to move. And now there's a whole area of law that is exploring the whole issue of what happens when a country, the entire population, relocates to another area. Do you retain your citizenship? Do you become that country in another place, retaining your rights, benefits, values, social mores, etc., or do you become part of your host country with its values, norms, legal systems, etc.? So it raises all kinds of interesting dynamics. And when we talk about climate justice, we speak about it in the context of the polluter must pay principle. We speak about it in the context that we cannot be the ones who are so disadvantaged by your behavior that there is no consequence to you. And we are talking about social and economic disadvantage. Barbados has just taken over the Climate Vulnerable Forum, CVF, and the V20 Forum, which is the finance ministers grouping of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which means we'll be responsible for the central banks in that area as well in those countries. And there are 70 member countries. I'm going to leave it to you to Google them. But the Prime Minister has indicated that she is going to have 3 priority areas, debt and climate. And you will understand that if you have, for instance, Barbados, in order to stabilize its coastline, and Barbados is regarded as one of the exotic tourist destinations across the globe and one of the most desirable places to live anywhere in the world. Let's be real about that. If you have to spend $30 million to stabilize your coastline by building boardwalks, or what appears to be boardwalks, but what really are engineered systems to hold your beach and your coastline together, that is a tremendous amount of money. And what you are finding is that because we have to do this kind of adaptation work, because that is an example of climate adaptation. And let me pause to make the point that in the international banking system, money is available for mitigation, but there's very little money available for adaptation, and the split is roughly 67% available for mitigation, which is not the priority need of LDCs or small island developing states, and only about 37% available for us. So if you have to look for capital at 14+% to stabilize your coastline, that has nothing to do with your road infrastructure. It has nothing to do with trying to keep your beaches pristine. It has nothing to do with other losses or other expenditures. And it has nothing to do with the fact that you still have to try to meet the SDGs to create some level of sustainable development. So that debt, and climate-driven debt, is a significant component of Caribbean budgets, small island developing states generally, and LDCs. In addition to that, so debt and climate is one priority. Her second priority is the multidimensional impacts of climate, and I think I've been speaking to them, so you see how broad they are in terms of society, economy, and environment. And third, and I'm really pleased that she chose this, because it is not one of the things that one hears about commonly, and that is the whole issue of climate and health. And this is important because since there is a change in climate, there is an increase in certain opportunistic diseases and vector-borne diseases, so that chikungunya is appearing in places where it previously would not. Malaria, which are all mosquito-borne, appearing in places where it previously would not. Lyme disease, which is tick-borne and again driven by warming habitats, is appearing in the United States and Canada and in developed countries that would not normally see incidence of Lyme disease or high incidence of Lyme disease. So she is looking at the whole issue of the changing health impacts emerging from the climate crisis, the cost of addressing those impacts, the cost of training and upskilling your health system and your health worker to recognize and understand, identify, and treat these impacts, and then the fact that coming out of environmental crises, there is always a lot of post-traumatic stress, the equivalent of post-traumatic stress disorder. Because if you walk out of your house to discover that your country is gone, you have no job, everything that you've worked for virtually you have lost in the matter of a few hours. It places people under tremendous stress. So those are the three areas which the Prime Minister has identified as her priority areas. Seriously, how much time do I have left? 5 minutes? Okay. So let me just transition then very quickly to the marine component of it, which is what I was asked to look at as well. For those of you who have never walked along the shore on a moonlight night and hold a fella's hand or a girl's hand, you can't imagine what you're missing. So that, I talked about fishing earlier. When you live on an island, your existence is driven by the fact that you live on an island, whether it is the fact that you will be predominantly or primarily or significantly an eater of fish, or it's a significant part of your diet, whether it's a substantial part of national livelihoods, foreign exchange earnings from exports, whether it is the kind of romantic evening that you might have, whether it has to do with your landscape, that marine space is of extreme significance. And what is not known generally is that the Caribbean is as water stressed or as water scarce as sub-Saharan Africa. and it is a tourism destination. So you begin to understand water is necessary for life and for every single revenue-earning activity. As a result of climate change, we are experiencing land degradation, sargassum, depleted fish stocks, changes in migratory fish species, biodiversity loss, fisheries impacts, coral bleaching, coral reef destruction, ocean acidification, ocean warming, and the loss of mangroves and seagrasses, and of course there is the consequential impact to tourism. Let me make the point as well that Barbados' maritime space is land space is 432 square kilometers, but its marine space is 186,898 square kilometers, and that is true for all small island developing states. Am I on a panel of some sort? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, good. So I want to elaborate on that later. The 30 by 30 plan is a plan for establishing marine spatial planning, coastal zone management units, marine management areas. Your MPS's marine spatial planning will include how you manage competing needs and uses, sustainable development, marine biodiversity preservation, sustainable resources, waste to resource, like with the sargassum. Could we partner with McMaster, for instance, in developing projects where you take your sargassum, which are a waste, and turn them into some revenue-generating resource, the possibility of using ocean thermal energy or other wave movement for creating renewable energy. How do you exploit your resources sustainably? And the Caribbean has had a number of initiatives. The St. George's Declaration of Principles for Environmental Sustainability. In the case of the Eastern Caribbean Regional Ocean Policy Initiative. We're working with the High Ambition Coalition and the Global Ocean Alliance to address some of these issues. We are signing on to the new Beyond Biodiversity in National Jurisdictions, BBNJ Treaty, which was signed at the UN or agreed at the UN in March or April of this year. We are dealing with development, and some have developed sustainable fisheries plans, but I will elaborate on them during the course of the conversation. I just want to close on this point. I truly am grateful for the opportunity to come to share our experiences. But it would be remiss of me if I did not use the opportunity and the platform to make some possible suggestions, and therefore with your permission. There is a paucity of trained specializations in the Caribbean, like marine spatial planning, which is essential to our survival and to be able to make informed policy decisions. McMaster has the opportunity for scholarships, for student exchanges with the universities with which you partner, with the opportunity for the sale of technical skills, which would then be invested in a region with which you have chosen to partner. If you understand our problem, and this is why I've taken the time to personalize it and to make the story of climate change today, not just the data, but the human reality and the human experience. If you understand, then you can help to advocate on our behalf. The writing of papers, the whole issue of scholarship is about adding to literature, knowledge, and information. Offer scholarships or offer incentives or asks your students to come to the Caribbean and do research which adds to the body of knowledge around the climate experience and around the multiple climate disciplines. I cited work on sargassum, lead advocacy. You yourself, and I was very, very pleased to hear of the zero carbon and other initiatives that you are pursuing, because the reduction of emissions helps significantly. And if you advocate and lobby for others, wherever university campuses are located, and this was one of the principles of the Higher Education Sustainability Initiative, which I launched when I was with the UN, you become a powerful influence for economic growth of that activity, but you also, of that area, but you also have an opportunity to influence behaviors and the marketplace. People rent from you, they want to sell to you, you have providers of goods and services. You can particularly offer women entrepreneurs specific opportunities. You can offer to opportunities for people from disadvantaged communities. You can say that you are not purchasing from people unless they have certain environmental standards. Perhaps you already do. And if you do, I applaud you. But if you do not, and a majority of universities do not, this is an area in which you can champion, raise your profile, enhance your substantial reputation, and it can become a powerful attractant for students, because I think a lot of young people realize that our generation messed up and they're interested in doing better and would be significantly interested in coming to a university that holds these principles and standards there, in addition to your wonderful academic reputation. I realize that I have to pause. And I do so happily, because I hope that I have made my message today personal. That I haven't just given you statistics and data, but that I tried to take you to the Caribbean with me, whether it was on a moonlight night, hearing the lap of the waves against the shore and watching the silver reflection on the moon, or watching your vehicles swept away in water and part of your roof get crushed by a rock. You see, because the Caribbean experience isn't just the exotic third world destination. The Caribbean experience, that we have built the Caribbean into a beautiful place. Our challenge is that climate change is now reducing it to a third world destination. And it does not have to be like that. So I speak to you as a Caribbean sister, saying that now you have heard. You have a responsibility to do differently, to advocate for us, to change your behaviors, and in fact, to change the world. Nelson Mandela said that poverty is a man-made construct, and men and women can change it. Climate change is a man-made phenomenon. And men and women of goodwill, pure intent, and exerted effort can redeem the world, can stop the crisis, can bring climate change to an end. I thank you.